I was mad when I first discovered our crew's mistake, but once I tasted it, all was forgiven. That is a direct quote from master distiller Eddie Russell. And honestly, it's such a perfect hook because it reveals how a massive, totally accidental mingling of liquids at a legendary distillery ended up creating one of their most beloved, award-winning batches. It really just shows you the unpredictable, deeply human magic of making whiskey. So welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into the deep Kentucky roots, the complex history, and the absolutely uncompromising standards behind one of the most iconic bourbons on the planet, Wild Turkey. We're going to look at how this brand survived Prohibition, built a literal dynasty, and managed to keep its old-school soul in a hyper-modern market. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll hit the Wild Turkey legend, then look at their deep Kentucky distilling roots, and meet the Russell family dynasty. After that, we'll break down their uncompromising standards and complexity, uncover some glute-era gold, and finally, wrap things up with a modern bourbon legacy. Let's get into it. Section 1. The Wild Turkey Legend. Now, before we even talk about the liquid itself, you really have to understand the rugged, completely serendipitous culture that birthed its name. I mean, how exactly did a routine hunting trip create a mainstream liquor store staple that experts actually refer to as the Clint Eastwood of whiskeys? It sounds like a Hollywood script, right? But the reality is beautifully simple. There's this wild contrast between the brand's massive pop culture footprint today and its incredibly humble origins. Picture this. It's 1940. Distillery executive Thomas McCarthy grabs some warehouse whiskey samples to share with his buddies on a wild turkey hunt in the Carolinas. Well, the very next year, those same friends asked him to bring more of, quote, that wild turkey bourbon, and the name just stuck. Over the decades, it evolved into a huge cultural icon, picking up these affectionate nicknames like the Kickin' Chicken and the Dirty Bird. I mean, it's shown up everywhere from Buffy the Vampire Slayer to a massive creative partnership with Matthew McConaughey. But hey, do not let the pop culture fame and the funny nicknames fool you. Beneath that Kicking Chicken moniker is some seriously sophisticated liquid. The late legendary spirits writer Michael Jackson famously described it as a huge whiskey, pointing out its style and its robustness. He's actually the one who coined it the Clint Eastwood of whiskeys. It's tough, it's classic, and it absolutely commands respect. Which brings us to Section 2. Deep Kentucky distilling roots. Because long before that fateful 1940 hunting trip, there was a physical distillery with roots stretching all the way back to the 19th century. In 1869, the Ripey brothers founded the distillery in Tyrone, Kentucky, and they built a booming business. They even represented Kentucky at the 1893 World's Fair. But then 1919 hits, Prohibition rolls in, and forces the doors closed. It wasn't until the repeal of Prohibition in 1933 that the Ripey family was finally able to rebuild. They started producing whiskey under contract again, surviving just in the nick of time for that 1940 hunting trip to give the liquid its forever name. And this classic emblem? It's a true testament to incredible resilience. I mean, it survived decades of industry turmoil, the utter devastation of Prohibition, and multiple ownership changes, bouncing from Austin Nichols to Pernod Ricard, and eventually to Campari. Yet through all of those corporate shifts, the iconic bird is still proudly intact. Moving on to Section 3, the Russell family dynasty. You really can't have legendary bourbon without legendary makers. And that brings us to the number 101. Now, if you know bourbon, you know 101 is the famous proof of Wild Turkey's flagship bottle. But back in 2018, that number took on a totally different, incredibly special meaning. It represented the combined years of experience of the father and son master distillers, Jimmy and Eddie Russell. Let's break down this family tree, because it's amazing. First, you have Jimmy Russell, lovingly known in the industry as the Buddha of bourbon. He started sweeping floors there in 1954 and grew to become the world's longest-tenured active master distiller, over 65 years. Then you've got his son, Eddie Russell, who joined in 1981, also starting at the very bottom as a relief operator, and he earned his co-master distiller title in 2015. They are literally the only active father-son duo in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. And today, the third generation, Bruce and Joanne, are in there actively blending and representing the brand. That generational mastery is the absolute anchor of their consistent quality. And what's great is they bring a ton of heart and humor to the job too. Back in 2012, Jimmy Russell actually wrote a formal letter to President Obama offering the distillery grounds as a retirement home for the annual presidentially pardoned Thanksgiving turkey. He seriously requested the bird join the staff as their spokesbird. It just perfectly captures the brand's authentic, lighthearted charm. Section 4. Uncompromising standards and complexity. All right, let's pivot to the liquid itself.
The Russells enforce some incredibly strict craftsmanship standards. First, they use a lower barrel entry proof, which experts argue retains a lot more complex flavor from the distillation process. Step 2, they utilize a high rye mash bill to give it that signature bold, peppery spice. Step 3, specific fermentation techniques using both modern steel and historic cypress tanks. And finally, they age the liquid in barrels featuring a heavy No. 4 alligator char. That deep char acts as a massive flavor filter, imparting the rich vanilla, caramel, and smoky oak notes that you taste in every single sip today.
And having that strict, instinctual understanding of flavor profiles is exactly what allowed them to capitalize on the mistake we talked about at the very beginning of this explainer. The Forgiven batch happened when a crew member accidentally mingled 78% aged bourbon with 22% rare rye. Now, because Eddie Russell's palate is so refined by those standards, he tasted it and immediately recognized that this technically ruined batch was actually a beautifully spicy, oaky masterpiece. He bottled it, and it became a massive award-winning hit. Talk about a happy accident.
Section 5, the Glut Era Gold.
That ability to find magic in the barrels leads us to a really fascinating period. Believe it or not, economic hardship actually created a holy grail for whiskey nerds. The 1980s were known as the Glut Era because, well, bourbon just wasn't cool. Distilleries were struggling, some were closing for good, and they had these massive surpluses of aging whiskey. So, to move the product, producers like Wild Turkey took incredibly mature, top-tier stocks, we're talking sometimes up to 20 years old, and blended them into their standard bottom-shelf everyday releases. The result? Absolutely legendary. If you compare the famous 1988 Wild Turkey 12-year export, which collectors affectionately called cheesy gold foil because of its packaging, against a modern 101, the difference is wild. The 1988 Glut Era batch is famous for these dense butterscotch, fermented fruit, antique leather, and funky rum notes, all thanks to that incredibly old whiskey hidden inside. Modern releases are fantastic for sure, but they lean a bit more toward bright sweet corn, vanilla icing, and cinnamon candy. Those Glut Era batches were essentially an accidental luxury born out of an industry crisis. And that brings us to Section 6, a modern bourbon legacy. The industry definitely didn't stay in crisis, but today, Wild Turkey refuses to just chase fads. Instead, Eddie Russell spearheaded the Master's Keep line to experiment with premium aging. Together, Jimmy and Eddie created Russell's Reserve to showcase highly mature small batches. And yeah, they even successfully collaborated with Matthew McConaughey to create Long Branch, which is this really unique mesquite-finished bourbon. They're innovating, absolutely, but always on their own terms, preserving the old-school standards that got them here. This careful balancing act really caught the eye of Italy's Gruppo Campari, who bought the distillery in 2009 for $575 million. And Campari has invested heavily in the Kikenshin's future. They built a stunning, state-of-the-art visitor center committed to rigorous environmental waste and water management standards, and they're expanding operations right now with a second distillery to push production to an astonishing 14 million proof gallons a year. The brand has seen a massive global resurgence. So I'll leave you with this final thought. In an industry absolutely flooded with trendy new spirits, celebrity tequilas, and fast-tracked whiskeys everywhere you look, will the uncompromising, old-school standards of the Kick and Chicken continue to reign supreme? Well, based on their deep Kentucky roots, that steadfast Russell family dynasty, and their legendary ability to adapt without losing their soul, I'm pretty sure the smart money is on the bird. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope you walk away with a much deeper appreciation for the liquid in your glass.